Welcome to the 2022 510K Industry Survey webinar. We're really excited that you've joined us this afternoon. My name is Brian Feldhaus, and I'm the VP of Legal, Regulatory, and Compliance at DuVal Associates, and we're happy to have you today. As many of you know, we at DuVal Associates have been champions of the industry, and 10 years ago, DuVal Associates and Introworks completed a survey of industry professionals to obtain feedback on FDA's management of the 510K program and experiences in working with the program. This survey was originally titled the 510K Pathway MedTech Industry Survey and was intended to measure industry's perceptions of FDA's management. A lot has changed over the past 10 years, and we've done the survey again, and this time NAMSA has also joined our sponsorship. Round 2 of the survey was completed earlier this year, and as we'll see in today's presentation, the results of that survey show encouraging improvement in FDA's management of the 510K program, but also chronicle some ongoing opportunities for improvement. Today, we're happy to provide to you our insights regarding the survey 10 years later. To provide those insights, we've assembled a panel of FDA law and regulatory experts that collectively have decades of experience in the 510K program. From DuVal Associates, we have Mark DuVal, President and CEO. We have Lisa Pritchard, VP of Regulatory Quality, Clinical and Engineering. Kathy Herzog, Senior Regulatory Quality and Compliance Consultant. And Patrick Johnson, Senior Regulatory Quality and Compliance Consultant. Also joining us today is Bob Freitag, President of Introworks. Introworks has long been a marketing, branding, communications firm that has long served the medical device industry and has assisted us with the survey. To kick us off today, we're going to first turn it over to Mark DuVal to provide a historical introduction of the 510K survey 10 years ago and today. Mark?
Thank you, Brian. So I want to start out by being a bit of a historian here. Forgive me because of my tenure in the industry, but we want to give you some context for our 2012 survey and this 2022 survey. Is around 2010, Bob will recall this, our firm created the Minnesota Medical Device Alliance, which is an organism, if you will, not an organization, for 110 CEOs, and we had venture capitalists and inventing physicians, with the goal of providing input to FDA about their administration of the 510K program. We were politically very active. I remember taking a consortium of 10 people to FDA, 3 CEOs of medical device startups, 3 venture capitalists, 2 inventing physicians, and a colleague from a Minnesota regulatory affairs firm. We met with Dr. Shuren, the director of CDRH, and 16 other FDA colleagues for 2 hours on a Friday at the end of the week, end of the day at CDRH headquarters. Our goal was to inform the agency of how their policies were impacting innovation and investment in innovation. After that meeting, we engaged in many activities to influence FDA going forward. We met with members of Congress to explain our case, and we decided to do an industry survey of FDA's performance. During that time frame, a number of surveys had been done addressing FDA's performance. The first was done by Dr. Josh Macauer with Exploramed and Stanford University. The title of their report was FDA Impact on U.S. Medical Technology Innovation, a survey of over 200 medical technology companies. Later surveys, and then he came up with the conclusion that the FDA was unpredictable, inefficient, and inexpensive regulatory processes are jeopardizing America's leadership position in medtech innovation. So later surveys were done by the California Health Institute, MEDIC, which is the Medical Innovation Competitiveness Coalition, and Northwestern University in Chicago actually did 2 surveys of FDA. All roughly concluded the same thing as Dr. Macauer's study. Here was FDA's reaction to Macauer's study. Dr. Shuren strongly refuted that 75% of the cost to bring a device to market was being spent clearing regulatory hurdles. In fact, his quote, part of the quote was, Shuren told Mass Device the study was, quote, highly flawed, unquote, and, quote, well below the quality of a good study, unquote. So he denounced the study overall. And So we then we did a survey in 2012, which was shown here. And as you can, and then there was a reaction also from Dr. Shuren to our study. And I remember him calling after the study was released. He said, in an emailed response, a spokeswoman for the FDA said this survey sheds no new light and is less informative than many prior surveys of medtech industry leaders. So Dr. Shuren's conclusion for basically all the studies is about the same. The last thing I will share is that we filed a 52-page citizen petition with FDA challenging their administration of the 510K program. And we spoke from the podium all over the country challenging FDA. We, in combination with many, many others, were successful in getting Congress engaged to prod FDA to follow the statute, the regulations, and guidance more closely, and to create other guidance which has helped the industry understand FDA's thinking. But FDA is slipping again, and it's impacting innovation. So we are at it again. As Brian noted in his introduction, FDA does not always follow the definitional elements of the 510K program, continues to escalate data requirements, and struggles with truly being least burdensome. This survey and future surveys will be directed toward getting them back on track. I'll now turn it over to our partner, Bob Freitag of Introworks, to briefly talk about the survey.
Well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, this year was another, I'd say, huge success in the amount of participation that we got. We touched on a few of the numbers and the amount of participants we got. This slide highlights that, so we know exactly who we're talking to in the industry. You'll see we had well over 200 participants in the survey. We qualified them by the screen out question that they had recent experience with the FDA. So we know that that everything that we're hearing in here is current. You'll also see the mix of participants that we had, from investors and board members to the executive management level, and a huge section, 41% being regulatory affairs. So this is a very qualified audience and voice that we're hearing. And we also got a very good mix from the different offices. When we look at the Office of Health Technologies and the different ones that we got participation for, I mean, not a large group from the orthopedic, but pretty substantial in the rest of them. And again, a mix of size of companies as well. Focused, I'd say, on the smaller ones, which I think this group would all agree that's where a lot of the innovation is going, and a lot, the performance of the FDA is critical. So from a participation and, if he wants to, or as we said, challenge the findings of the survey, this is a voice of many experienced people within the industry. So turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Let's jump into the survey. The survey was broken down into different segments of the 510K process. And the first segment that we're going to talk about is the refusal to accept policy. The purpose of the RTA, or refusal to accept policy, is to assess whether a submission is administratively complete, and that includes all of the information that FDA requires to conduct a substantive review and make a decision or determination of substantial equivalence. In their survey, we asked respondents whether FDA had refused to accept their submissions under the RTA policy, and if so, the reasons for that refusal. The survey results indicate that just less than half of the respondents had a submission rejected under the RTA checklist. And the vast majority of the rejections, nearly 75% of the respondents, indicated that their rejection resulted from the lack of the amount of data that was needed or the type of data that was needed for their submission. Only 1/3 of the rejections were resulted from the submission not satisfying the definitional criteria of the 510K process. Also interesting from the survey regarding the RTA process is the number of appeals. 72% of respondents indicated that an appeal was not required, whether informal or formal, and that they were able to work out the RTA issues with the reviewer, whereas 22% did informally appeal and 6% formally appealed. And so I think this shows good progress in FDA's collaboration with industry in terms of working out RTA issues. But I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to get their specific insights regarding this data from the survey. And I'm specifically interested in whether you think FDA's administering the RTA policy according to its intent, and what are some of the strategies that you've employed to avoid a refusal to accept letter from FDA. Who wants to take that one?
I'd be happy to start with that. I mean, I would suspect in many cases, FDA is administering the policy how they meant to. And kind of what I base that on is in the submissions that DuVal Associates has submitted, I can't think of one that got stuck with an RTA decision. Where we deal with them comes when clients receive them and need some help digging out from that. When they issue the RTAs, I think that's when they kind of go beyond the scope of the policy. So if they have some reasonable cause for issuing an RTA, we'll often see them stuff those with additional questions that should be really coming up in the substantive review. As far as tactics for avoiding it, one that I like to use is using the RTA checklist kind of as a QC check of the submission before it goes in. But I think probably one of the main things that we do is to use the submission as an advocacy document and really work to hold the reviewer's hand through why they're seeing the data that they are in the submission and why that data is sufficient.
Yeah, I would agree, Lisa. I think, again, the primary issues we're seeing with RTA are when there is a failure to have complete content in the submissions themselves, and then at least in our experience, and we're usually avoiding that upfront with the ones that we're working directly on prior to submission, and potentially including that RTA checklist that really in the submission to really identify where those elements are covered. So it's harder for FDA to argue back that the 510K elements are not included.
Another point to consider is sometimes I've seen FDA get hung up on an RTA judgment where they believe a rationale provided means the submission is not administratively complete. Whereas it is complete, it's just FDA doesn't agree upfront with the rationale and is trying to debate that during the RTA process as opposed to the substantive review. So in cases where you do have a rationale in lieu of testing, to be proactive about that in the cover letter and the executive summary to position that appropriately so that FDA recognizes it was addressed, but addressed through rationale.
Yeah, let me put a finer point on what Kathy just said, which I think is an excellent point. The RTA was never designed to be a surrogate or a precursor to an actual review. It was just basically supposed to be a ministerial checklist to say, hey, if you hit it, you're accepted, and now we're going to go for the actual substantive reviews. So to the extent that a reviewer is starting to insert judgments about whether the quantum and the quality of the evidence you have is sufficient, or you meet the definitional interpretations of the 510K program, that's inappropriate. And because some of these are truly debatable, and we make a living appealing those because oftentimes the FDA does disagree with you. And I think sometimes what they're trying to do is buy themselves additional clock time on the clock. FDA is famous for this. User fees we negotiate every 4 years, and here we go again. They just got some more, an additional user fee authorization, but we have to be careful and hold FDA's feet to the fire on a lot of this stuff. So I'll stop there, Brian, because I know we have a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, I did want to mention quickly, Mark, and maybe Lisa, you can speak to this, the new eStar filing program. How does that affect the RTA process in your experience?
So, I mean, for the present time, the eStar process is voluntary, and kind of as an incentive to get people to do that, it bypasses the RTA review. So you don't have any risk of FDA delaying the start of the clock for that. There is a technical review that occurs that's a bit different than it, but that is a significant advantage for the eStar. And I think it's late 2023 that will become mandatory for the 510K program. And will be interesting to see if they continue that benefit of bypassing RTA. The other advantage I see with that is eStar really provides a lot of tips within the template that if you follow them, your submission should be administratively complete. It's more challenging, I think, to do the advocacy piece with it. So be more deliberate about that.
Thanks, Lisa. So let's move on to the next segment of the survey, which concerned AINE and NSE letters. And most people don't know what an AINE letter. It's really a precursor to an NSE decision from the FDA. And with respect to AINE and NSE letters, the survey focused on three particular aspects: the frequency of the issuance of these types of letters, the timeliness of these letters, so when in the review period was an AINE or an NSE letter issued, and third, whether the data was reviewed by the FDA prior to the issuance of these letters. And so let's dive into the survey results of it. One of the most interesting results that I think of the survey is that most respondents did not receive an AINE or NSE letter during the 510K review. In fact, 80% of the respondents did not receive that sort of a letter, and only 21% of respondents did. And again, similar statistic for NSE decisions. 87% of respondents did not receive an NSE determination from the FDA in their 510K submission. Letter timeliness, however, is a little bit different of an issue. Of the respondents that did receive an AINE letter, most of those AINE letters were received late in the process. And the survey results provide some really interesting insights regarding FDA's management practice regarding the use of AINE letters. Of all the respondents, only 37% received an AINE within the first 60 days of the filing of the submission, whereas 68% of respondents received an AINE late in the process. So after the AINN process, at the very end of the review period, with really little time or no time at all to respond. The other interesting takeaway from the survey was that of the respondents that had received an AINE letter, most survey respondents, 60%, said that FDA should not have issued the AINE at the 11th hour of the submission and could have done so earlier. And then the final takeaway regarding the survey results indicate that in 21% of the submissions, FDA made an NSE decision without reviewing the data. So it made a decision on the definitional elements of the 510K process alone, and which is likely reflective of a late issuance by FDA of the decision. And so taking the timeliness, the frequency, and whether data is reviewed by FDA or not, we can provide an interesting comparison between 2012 and 2021. In 2012, 34% of the respondents indicated that FDA did review and consider performance or clinical data before making a decision of NSE or possibly NSE, whereas that percentage has grown to 61% as of 2021. And this survey result suggests some performance improvement by FDA, that it's increasingly considering data before making an NSE decision. And so turning back to the panelists, the first question is, number one, are these results surprising to you based upon your own practices? And in particular, are you surprised by the low number of respondents that had received AINE or NSE letters during the course of their submissions?
I guess I'm not really surprised by the results of them. If anything, I might be surprised at how high the number of AINE letters is. I think it does demonstrate that these are a minority of the 510Ks going through. So I think that's positive. It is a little disturbing, the data that you have there on the timeliness of the issuance of the AINE. And I think that is probably, to me, one of the key issues that needs to be resolved in the program.
Go ahead, Mark.
I would second that. The most disturbing number I saw, and this is on this slide, the 31%, the AINN letter, if they have a problem, if they say that you don't meet the definitional elements of the 510K program, a couple of problems with that. One is you really you should tell a company much earlier than that. You shouldn't let them go through a 6-month AINE process plus the 90-day clock. You could be upwards of 240 to 270 days out when you get that AINE letter, and that's unacceptable practice on the part of FDA. So that's the first thing. This is a thing called stage-gated reviews, where FDA likes to just at the definitional elements, you know, they really should be reviewing the data. And sometimes they just want to review the definitional elements of the 510K program. And if you don't have the data, they don't care. They don't want to look at that because they're going to make that cut just at the definitional level. And sometimes the data do inform the 3 definitional elements and would help them make that decision. And they really, if we're going to pay user fees for a complete review, I think they owe it to us to review the data.
And Lisa, have you experienced the same trend that other survey respondents have experienced, in that FDA from 2012 to 2021 reflected on this slide, that there is an improvement by FDA in reviewing some of that information?
I'd say yes. But where you get the situation where they haven't reviewed the data, it's very difficult to argue with them that they have a responsibility to do it.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. I think the one thing that I would say is a flag should go up if you're receiving a late stage AINE letter, like particularly if you received an AINN letter first and responded to it, and then it turns into an AINE letter. Those really are the cases where something's gone off track with the review and FDA is not doing their job the way they're supposed to be doing it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see in the post-COVID experience now, as we're getting back to whatever the new normal is with FDA, and as far as the review process goes, you know, if this will shift at all. And I think, you know, at least some of this, it's great to see that FDA, at least on the feedback from the 2 studies, 2 surveys, that increase in FDA's at least reference to their content knowledge and having reviewed the content. That's positive, but again, that should be 100% of the time if you're seeing something like an ANE or NSE feedback. So again, I would expect that to be higher than that, but yeah, I guess directionally encouraging.
The next subset of questions that we inquired about in the survey concerned rejections or pauses of 510K submissions. And we specifically asked respondents, did the FDA provide a reason or justification for the basis of its decision to reject or pause your review? And in most instances, 90% of those instances, yes, FDA did provide a reason or justification. And looking at those reasons or justifications, I think is really insightful. The most common reason for a rejection or pause of a submission is due to different technological characteristics that raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. In fact, 17 respondents indicated that that was the basis for rejection or pause of their submission. The next most frequent was due to the lack of a legally marketed predicate that had a different intended use as the device that was under review. And then the final reason that FDA frequently provided was a proposed indication that altered the intended therapeutic effect, resulting in a new intended use as a justification for FDA to either pause or reject the submission. This is also an interesting comparison between 2012 and 21 and regarding least burdensome principles and how frequently FDA is mentioning least burdensome principles in the course of their decision-making process. In 2012, 75% of respondents indicated that no, FDA had not mentioned the use of least burdensome principles in making their decision for 510K submissions. That number dropped 20% to 55% in 2021, which shows that FDA is getting better at referencing least burdensome requirements in their communication. But when we dig a little bit deeper, the survey results indicate something else entirely. Most of the respondents, 31 of the respondents out of the 44 total respondents to the survey, indicated that yes, least burdensome principles were mentioned in FDA's decision making, but that was it. FDA had simply provided lip service or boilerplate least burdensome or references to least burdensome in a boilerplate manner without any sort of specific application of the least burdensome principles in the decision making, which is a fairly substantial increase from the 16 respondents that had mentioned that in 2020, in 2012. And then with respect to NSEs, we asked respondents if FDA suggested it may issue or actually issue an NSE decision or determination, did any of the following occur? It's clear from the survey that when FDA references or issues an NSE, it's usually associated with a request for more data that exceeds the data that the predicate had provided. In fact, 31 of the 44 respondents to this question indicated that FDA had in fact solicited data that exceeded the scope of the data provided by the predicate. And so the takeaway is that most respondents acknowledge that FDA's NSE decisions are based upon data requests that exceed what was previously done. And so turning to the panelists, have you experienced similar trends either with respect to NSE decisions or the least burdensome principles regarding pauses or rejections by FDA in your submissions? And if so, what factors do you think are driving those trends today as compared to 2012?
So I'll say I think there definitely is a trend toward increasingly pausing or rejecting submissions. And in my mind, I think there are two key causes for that. I think the main one is one that has been discussed earlier a little bit, is the impact of the user fee metrics, because FDA is funded largely from the user fees, and the metrics are set up based on the number of days that they are completing their review in. And I mean, that's a whole nother topic, how the statistics for those are reported. But it basically sets up a situation where it is to FDA's advantage to delay the start of a clock or to stop a clock. And that's what the pauses and rejections end up doing. The second cause that I think is contributing to it is the incredible turnover in FDA staff, where it seems like you can almost go into the CDRH management directory any day and you'll see different names there, or increasing numbers of vacancies in key positions. That same turnover that's happening with management at FDA is also happening at the review staff levels. So we're getting less experienced reviewers doing more complicated devices. And I think that equates to pauses and rejections.
I would fully agree with that, Lisa. And I think the other one, as we looked at back at slide 20 on the reasons for rejection or pauses, it was really two groupings. One was the technological characteristics differing significantly or significantly enough. The other kind of grouping of those next two were intended use or indication for use variants from the predicate. I think those are more in our control, obviously, and how we align with those. But the technological differences one that is kind of a natural, as we look at the evolution of devices and how do we carefully explain and address those in the 510Ks is going to be a key consideration for getting through the process and avoiding, or at least minimizing, the likelihood of rejection or pause, even given the state of the relative maturity of the review staff and the management staff at FDA, trying to minimize the impact of that. So again, I think that's a critical consideration, is really addressing those technological differences in the substantive content of the submission.
To echo what Lisa shared earlier is the importance, therefore, of advocacy in your executive summary, and in particular, the presentation of substantial equivalence comparison and how you present your risk argument. Often FDA gets hung up where there may be data suggesting a particular safety concern is escalating or increasing in frequency, and perceives that as a different question of safety and effectiveness, as opposed to it being a risk that is known or characterized with the class of devices, but may have a slightly different presentation with a new device. Not necessarily different, but there are semantics here in the argument of if technological characteristic differences do raise different questions. That's where advocacy and helping FDA appreciate the data as interpreted by the sponsor, as opposed to just giving the data and opening their up for their interpretation versus influencing it based on your interpretation of the data.
I would add, go ahead. No, you go first, Patrick.
No, I was going to jump to the least burdensome, Mark. If you want to talk about the rejection, go ahead.
Well, I was going to do both. So why don't you go first and then I'll follow you.
Sure, just least burdensome. I think I was kind of surprised actually that we didn't have a higher rating on that, because FDA is very good about including that in the boilerplate content of the responses, the formal responses. So, I think again they do a good job of addressing least burdensome on a more of a boilerplate level, and that continues to be an area of challenge for how do we interpret and apply least burdensome. And again, with, as Lisa had said about this less experienced staff, even makes that more challenging, right? And not just the staff, but the management teams are less experienced, and they're covering more because they're covering more of the staff kind of limitations as well, I would say. So this will continue to be a challenge for us.
Yeah, and what I wanted to add to both those, if you could go back to slide 20 for just a minute, Brian. The reason for rejection or pause, you know, that Patrick noted this, if you combine the bottom two, those are both related to intended use, so you got a 12 there in essence. But so you got the two biggest issues being raised are whether they're due to different technological characteristics that raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. That's combining two of the three 510K criteria. And as Kathy noted, a lot of times we're having to debate the agency on these. And I think, Patrick, you might have mentioned that you use the word evolution. We oftentimes try and present to the FDA, look, if you look at the evolution of the predicate family, the technological characteristics, you know, the big jump, if there's any leap or difference in the predicate family, it might be in products or devices that preceded your submission. And then the FDA will tell you, well, you've got different technological characteristics. And we'll say, well, look, ours is very modest in comparison to the big jumps you made before us. And so in the span of this family, we really are not an outlier. And we often win on that argument in the submission level. But on same intended use, you know, the bottom line for all of these definitional criteria is that FDA is getting increasingly constrictive in how they're interpreting the 510K program and bouncing more products out onto the de novo path, because they're not tethered, if you will, to the substantial equivalence level of data showing in comparison to the predicate device. There they get, it's basically reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness in an absolute and independent sense as like a PMA, although albeit a PMA light or a you know, so I think that's the concern, is trying to keep ourselves on the 510K path, because it does restrict FDA's discretion in the amount, the quantum, the quality of data that they can request. And the second point I wanted to make is on slide 22, Brian. And this is what Patrick was noting. I think it's increasingly disappointing that, yes, they do a boilerplate job of reciting in a hollow fashion that they've considered least burdensome requirements, but do they give you any degree of specificity? They don't. They you know, look in 2021, it's encouraging to see that in three cases out of the 44, they actually recited their own guidance document and went into it. And in the next one, it says the reasons provided were specific and detailed. That's good. That's a total of 7. There's 6 where some reasons were provided, but they were not specific or detailed at all. And you've got 31 saying they were mentioned. And that's the point. You really got to tease out of them. Look, you got to articulate with some degree of specificity why you feel you're being least burdensome, i.e. you're requiring the minimum necessary under the statutory definition, information required to make this decision.
Thanks, Mark, for that. The other aspect of NSE and possibly NSE decisions that we wanted to talk about and present today concerns appeals. From 2012 to 2021, we're seeing fewer companies appealing FDA decisions. In fact, there's a pretty substantial reduction in the number of appeals, a 15% decrease of NSE decisions during the course of the last 10 years. And so, certainly that represents a positive development. Another really positive development is the length of an appeal following an NSE or possibly NSE decision. In 2012, most of the respondents, 13%, experienced an appeal that lasted more than 20 weeks, which is a substantially long time. And only 3 respondents had that same sort of experience in 2021, only three respondents in total. And in fact, most of the respondents currently that have appealed an NSE decision, 6 of them experienced a length of an appeal of 5 to 10 weeks. And so, Mark, I know we frequently handle appeals for clients from submission decisions. Does this data support or change how you would suggest we advise clients regarding appeals of NSE decisions or other adverse decisions during the review process?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think what's happening here is when they don't appeal, it doesn't necessarily mean that they believe FDA is right. Invariably, they believe FDA is wrong. But what they're doing is being relegated to the de novo path at that point. They feel like there's no use in fighting the agency, and an appeal would be expensive and time consuming, and maybe you'd be a faster path just to accept where you're at and provide the additional data that they're requiring and then refile under the de novo path. So that's probably what's happening in a lot of those cases. But the appeal processing time is the good news in all of this. And that is they are making decisions, I think, faster. And that's, I would attribute a lot of that to Dr. Mazel's leadership as director of Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, OPEC. I think he's really brought some discipline to this, and I think they do a really good job of trying to get you a final decision, good, bad, or indifferent, and that's very helpful. And when I say indifferent, sometimes the result is not that you win or that FDA loses, the review staff loses on an appeal. It's that Dr. Mazel or Owen Ferris or somebody deputized by Dr. Mazel comes up with a compromise, an acceptable compromise for the sponsor, and it saves face for the agency review staff. So that's really helpful, like maybe a post-marketing study or a change in the labeling, where you limit your labeling to a qualified claim or whatever. So that this part of it is getting better, and I think that, again, it's under the leadership of Dr. Mazel.
Speaking about the de novo pathway, that was the last segment that we wanted to present today regarding the survey. And specifically FDA's recommendations for companies to pursue the de novo pathway for their devices. There's really 2 interesting data points for our review. First, from 2012 to 2021, FDA's recommendation for use of the de novo pathway remained fairly constant, 70% to 72%. And in fact, 20% to 19%, only about 20% of respondents had indicated that FDA had recommended a de novo pathway for their product. The other interesting data point is whether companies actually pursued the de novo pathway. And there's a pretty substantial increase in the number of respondents from 2012 to 2021 that did pursue the de novo pathway, an increase of about 27% as compared to 2012. And so I want to ask you, Kathy and Lisa, I know you guys presented this year at the RAPS Convergence Conference with Dr. Peter Liang, who's leading FDA's de novo program. I think your presentation was it had a cute title, Traveling to De Novo Land, Planning for a Successful Journey. And so I wanted to see if you had any insights regarding the de novo pathway and how FDA views the de novo pathway based upon that recent presentation experience you had.
So when we presented with Dr. Yang at the recent RAPS Convergence, there's a lot of interest in de novo, which suggests that FDA is more aggressive, if you will, at suggesting either through pre-sub or through an NSE decision on a 510K that the 510K pathway is not appropriate for a particular new device. I think that the de novo is getting a little bit more rigor. Recently, regulations were released to codify the content of the submission and the review practices with de novo that were otherwise managed through guidance documents. However, when we compared notes with Dr. Yang in preparation for the de novo presentation, it was interesting the difference of opinion between industry, our perspective, and Dr. Yang's perspective in terms of the value of a de novo and the ability to use special controls to try and establish a competitive barrier. And the FDA's review of that, I think they tend to think of it as, yeah, that is kind of like a 510K, only it's just a different statutory review criteria of establishing an acceptable benefit risk. But from our perspective, we don't necessarily see that the data requirements are on par with the 510K. They tend to be more assertive and more aggressive in the data evidence required. So I do think industry's experience is such that they're maybe being shuttled over to the de novo pathway. Our criteria is, if you do have a legitimate reason to be in the 510K, don't let the de novo be an escape hatchway.
Thanks, Kathy. I think the couple of things that I would add to it, I agree with everything you said there. One of the pieces that I guess concerns me about the increase in the de novo program, even though I'm grateful that it's there and it's an appropriate middle step where we certainly don't want low or moderate risk devices that don't have a predicate to end up on a PMA path. So wholly support the de novo program from that aspect. But I mentioned earlier a concern about the impact of user fees on FDA decision-making. And I think this is a key place where that could occur. And Dr. Yang indicated that it does not impact the decision to push something to de novo. But I'll also say that he's working in the office where the decision is happening in the review divisions themselves. And if you look at the new user fees that just came out, there's a discrepancy of over $100,000 between a 510K and a de novo user fee for the standard fee, and over $30,000 for small businesses. So clearly that is a significant area that could influence that decision. I think from the content standpoint, just to build on what Kathy had said about the special controls, I think FDA was viewing those more as a checkbox of, yes, you have to propose your special controls that are going to be appropriate within the de novo, and you should have met those special controls with the data that's submitted. Where I think our perspective went a step further and suggested that the special controls could become a strategic piece within the submission, because of that higher user fee and the higher expectations of data, the person doing a de novo is blazing a trail for all of the companies that follow that will then turn around and use that grant decision as a predicate device to go through the more simplified 510K program. So the special controls are your opportunity to create a competitive barrier there and help get the most benefit out of your efforts. We'll go with that word.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Kathy.
I think Dr. Yang had a perspective that de novo will have an increasing role going forward, and that their attempts to streamline or standardize the content expectations in the review practice might help ease industry's interest and ability, if you will, in the de novo program. But to the extent that de novo is being used as an escape hatch from the 510K, it may be more strategic to appeal on the 510K pathway where you rightfully may belong, as opposed to defaulting to the de novo pathway. it is substantially more expensive. And if you look at the review timelines, FDA on average receives about 70 de novos a year, so it's a pretty low volume. And that's stratified, of course, across the offices. And their review time is more approximate to a PMA than it would be the statutory requirement of 120 days, the MODUFA goal being 150 days. But in reality, it's taking upwards of 250 to 300 days. So that tells you that the data burden and review cycle time is more like a PMA than a 510K. And given this is for low to moderate risk devices, that essentially would be 510K without the luxury of a predicate, that review timeline is not consistent with the 510K program.
Patrick, did you have something you want to say? Otherwise,
No, I think, we could go at length at the de novo content. There's a lot to unpack there, but I know we have limited time, and I think we want to get to the Q&A too. So Mark, did you have any key points to
but
this?
just quickly, I remember when de novo first came about, I remember that being assigned user fees. At first, they weren't at all. And when they got assigned, I was alarmed at how high they were in comparison to the 510K. And I remember speaking at a seminar saying, our concern is that a decision to go de novo or not would be biased by user fee economics. And I got some raised eyebrows and some contention from FDA on that. They weren't happy with that statement. But I think the difference is even more alarming now, right, Lisa? The gulf is even more alarming. And then the other thing is on special controls, don't fall asleep on special controls, because even when you create them and you hope them to be a barrier to market entry, you have to advocate for them vis-a-vis the next submission after you. We had a situation where we were not, our special control for the clinical trial that was done by our client our client came to us too late, but they said they had decided that they didn't need a clinical trial special control because they wanted the freedom for subsequent products to decide whether they were going to have a clinical trial or not. And that was very disturbing. Our client had spent all the money to create that barrier, that rightful barrier to market entry. And finally, to Kathy's point on de novo, when you're there, remember the data perceptions change. If you're looking on a continuum, it's like a lot of times the reason we stay with this 510K program is the psychological reason that we want them tethered to the idea that we're very close to being a 510K, and that it should be sort of safety and effectiveness in a comparative sense. When you get that in, when you get into the realm of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, like a PMA light, then their data expectations are going to change dramatically, and the time associated, of course, then is going to change dramatically. So sometimes it's worth the fight. It's often worth the fight to stay off the de novo path. Sometimes you just have to concede that's where you're at and just bite the bullet. But anyway, just food for thought.
Thanks, Mark. And then the final portion of today's presentation before we get to Q&A is just overall satisfaction comparison between 2012 and 2021. First, interestingly, there's a 24% increase in overall satisfaction among industry regarding FDA's management of the 510K pathway, and there's a fairly substantial decrease in the amount of respondents that were extremely dissatisfied with FDA's management of the 510K pathway. And so the takeaway from these data results, the survey, is that FDA has improved its management of the program and should certainly be commended for that, but still only about half of respondents are satisfied with the management process. And while that certainly exceeds historical presidential approval ratings, for example, there's opportunities for improvement. And some of the opportunities that we've identified as a group is the need for additional training for review staff on legal and regulatory issues related to 510K submissions, building on the trend of acknowledging least burdensome principles by improving transparency regarding application of those principles in decision-making, and then improving on performance related to the issuance of AINE letters so that they're issued appropriately in the timeline of the review process and not after months and months and rounds of AINN questions and responses. And so I know I got through those quickly, but we did want to get to the Q&A session for today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute your microphone and we'll address those. Patrick?
I was just going to, one of the questions that we've been getting, I think, from some clients is in regards to the amount of data required for 510Ks. And I think we highlighted this earlier in regards to compared to predicates especially, but maybe Lisa and Kathy, your feedback, and Mark, your feedback on the amount of clinical data or expanded technical data expectations from FDA, even when it's solidly within the 510K, purview.
I mean, I'd just say that's a difficult question to answer because it just varies based on the individual products. But I would encourage people to always be looking at the predicate family and what data were required there, because that really should be the standard of the type and amount of data that should be expected. I think there was one slide about the questions coming from FDA and the number of them that went beyond what had been expected for the predicate. And I think those are the ones where we should get concerned and push back. So I would look at the predicate family for that.
I'd also be aware of data requests. This is a little extraneous to the question, and then the core question is, of course, how much data should you have to provide, and particularly when is clinical data required? FDA's guidance documents still say that clinical data are not required for most 510Ks, and that should be your starting point. Now, predicate family will reveal whether you need to do that or not. But the collateral question I wanted to raise is, a point I wanted to raise is, FDA is increasingly, watch out for this, asking for information based on quality or manufacturing. I just had one today where they wanted to validate the manufacturing process and they wanted data related to that. That's irrelevant to a 510K determination. And FDA's own least burdensome guidance documents say that, at least a previous now decommissioned version of it, that they continually enact, if you will, they put together more recent guidance documents that take away some of the more charitable statements they've been making historically. But I always hold on to them and regurgitate them and recite them back to the agency to remind them of the opinion that they once held, which is, by the way, consistent with the statute and the regulations. Least burdensome decisions require that you only provide data that's relevant to a 510K determination. And oftentimes you're going to get them in the arena of clinical to want you to prove endpoints that were not part of the endpoints. They want you to revisit the clinical utility or the benefit of a device, which again is not part of the 510K determination. You inherit the underlying regulatory presumption that your device, that the predicate family has already established the essential safety and effectiveness of the device and has proven it by their data. And you need not revisit that. Don't let them push you there either. They cannot ask for you to to establish through data the clinical utility and benefit of your device. If you're on the 510K path, that's already been established by the predicates.
Thanks, Mark. We have received 2 questions in the Q&A function, so I'll read off the first question and we'll see you can handle that. The first question is, are you often involved in appealing additional data requests by FDA? Anyone want to take that question?
I can start before Mark jumps into it, because this is his specialty area. I would just say, yes, we often appeal extra requests from FDA. The one point I wanted to make about it is I found it really interesting at the recent convergence meeting for RAPs in the program presented by the ombuds for the different centers at FDA. There was a poll at the beginning of how many people ever disagreed with a decision FDA made or a question that they asked, and almost everybody raised their hand. Next question, how many have pushed back on a question from FDA? That went down to almost nothing. How many have used the ombuds program? Even fewer. And I think that's a piece where we really specialize, is in knowing where we can push back and effectively doing so while maintaining the relationships with FDA.
Yeah, and I would say, well, I may be, and Brian may be the specialist legally, and with Aaron Haig in our shop for doing appeals from a legal, framing it from a legal and regulatory perspective to get you guys. We really rely most heavily on folks like Kathy and Patrick and Lisa to frame as engineers and, scientists to really help us tee up the issues, because everything's an admixture of law, medicine, science, and policy, and we cannot do this alone. We need our clients, we need our in-house experts to tee up these issues. We know we have intuition as to how, as lawyers, what should be challenged and how to challenge it maybe, but to articulate the scientific and biomedical principles, engineering principles, we really need you folks to do that. But yeah, we do it a lot. And there's a lot of ways to do this informally. There's not just always formal appeals. We find insightful little ways, and some of it is relational, just because we know these people and all these OHTs, Office of Health Technologies 1 through 7. We know a lot of the people, and we know Dr. Maisel, and we know a lot of other folks, and we try and leverage our relationships and get questions answered. So there is no informal or formal appeal. But then you've got the least burdensome flag. You got a 21-day submission issues meeting. You've got a pre-sub, and then you can go into a 21 CFR 10.75 appeal to the next level of supervision. You got a 517A statutory appeal for, significant decisions, I should say, and that includes, an HDE. It includes a substantial equivalence decision, a not substantial equivalence decision, a PMA decision, a breakthrough designation decision. Ironically, what is not a significant decision under 517A of the statute, ironically, is a de novo decision. And that's called a non-SIP 517A decision. And so the benefit of having a 517A decision is 30 days to file the appeal, 30 days to have it heard in a hearing, 30 days for a decision, for a total of 90. Whereas under a non-517A appeal, you're under 21 CFR 10.75 of the regulations, which does not state any deadlines. So they try and adhere to the 30 days of a 517A, but oftentimes that gets protracted or elongated into a 60 or 90-day decision process, but or even longer. So 20, it's difficult with de novo. It's a mistake. They need to get de novo under the umbrella of that statute, and hopefully in future legislation they will do that.
Thanks, Mark. I know it's 12:59. We have a few more questions in the Q&A. I also want to make sure that you guys have enough time to provide a parting shot. Do you want to go a little longer, or how do you want to handle that?
Brian, I'd say we just take the questions. For anybody else to drop off, they drop off. Let's answer these questions.
Okay. The next question is, what are your thoughts on the FDA's template for electronic 510K submissions to be mandatory on October 1st, 2023, in terms of streamlining the 510K submission and review process?
So Lisa and I have done several eStar submissions. We're getting used to the template. As Lisa mentioned, there's some nice tips that are built in there, although some of the template sections are particularly onerous, particularly the biocompatibility section. It is going to become mandatory on October 1, 2023. They may do away with the letting go of the RTA. That may be reintroduced. I do think it is a means to streamline it, but I think it's a disappointment with the eStar template right now is it makes the 510K seem very modular, and it's much more difficult to tell the story because now you have so much of the data parceled out into attachments and small little blurbs that are built into the template to explain each section. So, and the executive summary, for example, comes at the end of the template. So I do hope that FDA will improve the template between now and next year when it becomes mandatory for all 510K types. But I do think it does streamline it. You do have to write it differently than perhaps you're used to with an e-copy submission. But you have to work harder to get your advocacy in there because of the way it's so chopped up now.
I agree with all of that. I think the benefit that I've seen to it is it does seem to streamline the review process. So most reviewers' feedback has been that it makes their life easier. There are some outliers in that, and I find that kind of curious. But I do like it if it makes their life easier and streamlines the process. I'm happy to use it. But as Kathy said, I think the big challenge with it is being more purposeful about advocating for the product, because it does make it more challenging to do that.
The next question concerns the Total Product Life Cycle Advisory Program. The question states the TPLC advisory program and the trend to push devices into de novo seem to be at odds with each other. Is this an accurate observation, and which trend is more apparent now?
So, the TAP program is more in a pilot phase right now with the Office of Cardiovascular Products, starting formally in January of 2023. But I don't know that it's really at odds with the de novo so much as, do you have a legitimate reason to be on the de novo pathway? I think, to me, the TAP program has yet to establish what its utility will be on par with other programs that FDA has already implemented for getting FDA feedback in a timely manner. My concern with TAP is, will it overprescribe FDA's role in the development activities of a new device? Would it be better to pursue risk mitigation through a pre-sub or a breakthrough designation with sprint meetings to reduce risk with a future de novo submission?
Thanks, Kathy. The next question says 30,000 in fees and 250 to 300 days for review seems untenable for early stage firms. Are the fees finalized at this point?
I assume that one is referring to the comments I made about the discrepancy in fees between 510K and de novo, and specifically at the de novo fees. And unfortunately, the fees are in place at this point. Each year, the user fees change somewhat. It was interesting that kind of since the inception of the program, it's been very modest little changes year to year. And this year is the first one with really a very significant leap in the fees. So I definitely would recommend taking a look at the user fee schedule.
Thanks, Lisa.
It is locked, but it is locked. And I think that it goes back to some of Mark's earlier points, maybe Lisa's, in regards to, if you're going to enter that process, make sure you do so with foreknowledge of the consideration for timeline and cost considerations, and maybe defining that with FDA better before really diving into that pathway. So, and pushing every option for the straight 510K rather than de novo.
This next question may require us to have an offline discussion, but the question states, I'm in a situation where FDA is signaling their decision may be to go de novo rather than 510K due to their interpretation of new delivery of a currently cleared technology. Nasal versus chest for clearance. Please comment on best approaches to get to the 510K path decision. So
I mean, it sounds like likely there's been some pre-sub communications with FDA. And, I think Mark is the one that raised the point about what's considered a significant decision. And certainly a communication in a pre-sub doesn't rise to that level to be an appealable thing. So I would say that it falls in the realm of needing to look at what the concerns are that FDA is raising and how to address those and advocate for why those concerns shouldn't push you off the 510K program, specifically based on the statutory definitional elements of intended use and technological characteristics. And I think we raised this a little bit earlier, that that the technological characteristics and whether they raise new questions of safety or effectiveness is one of the prime areas where FDA likes to question products for the 510K program. And it certainly is a very gray area. I would say that just makes it more ripe for advocating strongly for that position. I don't know if Mark, maybe you would have some additional insight for
Yeah,
how
well,
to
we,
deal with that.
at first blush, there's an opportunity to challenge this. They always like to say a different anatomical location might result in a new intended use or raise different questions of safety and effectiveness, but it is theoretically challengeable. And the vehicle for doing that maybe here, it might be a least burdensome, an LB flag. Because what the purpose behind an LB flag when they created it is they're saying, look, we don't want you to wait till the very end of the process and everything breaks down and now you file a formal appeal with us at management, when we could have gotten involved earlier. They described it, Dr. Maisel described it at an MDMA meeting as, look, a meteor is coming down. And if you let it enter the gravitational pull of the earth, it's very unlikely we can do anything to shift it at that point. But if you get it when it's still out in space, it's early enough, we might be able to affect the trajectory of that meteor and not let it land and explode in the location we don't want it to. So the idea with the least burdensome flag is maybe if you raise it, you might be able to get upper management's attention much earlier, and they might be able to bring some reasonableness to the review staff proceedings.
Building off of, go, it's Patrick, do you have something to say?
Well, I was just going to say, you know, as you look at the FDA's kind of flag there, and what are the key considerations for the differences in that route of delivery? I mean, is the end outcome measures, whether clinical or or bench or animal outcomes, the same kind of considerations regardless? And then what are the risk considerations that differ between the two? Because that'll be kind of the starting points I think you'd really get at with the argument for FDA and in those delivery route differences. So, and how much does that influence the evidence considerations?
And then the final question is a pre-submission meeting always desirable, or does it just invite FDA to issue a wish list? Great question. Who wants to tackle that one? Lisa.
I mean, I think the easy answer is no. A pre-sub is not always desirable. Certainly we use the pre-submission program a lot, and actually from a meeting Kathy and I attended on EU MDR yesterday, wish that there was a similar program for Europe. So it certainly has its place. But you need to be very strategic about when and how you use it, because keep in mind that any feedback that you request from FDA, you're eventually going to have to address in a subsequent submission. Certainly don't want to go to FDA with, I like to refer to it as a blank checkbook. You don't want to open the gates for them to fulfill their wish list. Because we're so close to Halloween, I would recommend going to our website and check out our client alerts. We have a really good series about the pre-submission program, including how best to use it and when to use it. That is based on equating FDA to the Addams family. So I think we came out with that around Halloween. So
we did.
I think that one still has a lot of really good content.
And maybe we can provide a link for that too. Thanks for that, Lisa. I want to be sure to give Bob and Mark plenty of time to offer the parting shots. And I wanted to again thank all the attendees for sticking around through the Q&A session. Mark and Bob, any parting comments?
Well, let me just say thank you to Bob for his friendship and partnership in all these years. And we've done a lot of things together. And this survey, we intend to continue on, probably on an every other year basis from now on. And because Bob really wants to chart, a year-to-year improvement or, downward trend. We want to see trends one way or another. And it's been fun. We are unabashed advocates for the industry. We're very passionate about it. And we just want to make sure that the ecosystem in which you operate stays healthy so that we can have a lot more medical device technology coming to patients. And it's been a fun ride and we've all enjoyed it. And I'm so proud of my staff and the folks here on this webinar. So thank you to you guys for participating. Bob?
Yeah, no, I echo your concerns for the industry and wanting to see it thrive. I mean, our interest obviously is wanting to always help companies bring these new wonderful technologies to market, and anything that kind of, if we can improve that process in any ways we want to. So the partnership and in doing these types of surveys is hopefully, we can continue to hold people accountable and see trends, right? The point of doing this and now coming down to in every other year scenarios, so we can start seeing trend lines in the marketplace, so we can indeed point to improvements. Hey, we're doing well. Let's give kudos, and where areas that we can help improve, fantastic. Because at the end of the day, if more medical devices, medical innovations get into the market, I think the better off we all are. It's one of the things we are very passionate about, this industry and what we can do for it.
Thank you, everyone.